Are we ready? Let's do it. Good afternoon. My name is Wayne Arden. I'm a volunteer member of the Sierra Club, and I will be your moderator for today's seminar. Just be aware that we are recording this session, and we expect it to last about 90 minutes. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to frame our discussion this afternoon a little bit. So if you look at greenhouse gas emissions in the United States in 2017, for the first time for the EPA, the emissions from the transportation sector exceeded those of the power sector. And if we look at the numbers in 2018, again from the EPA, the transportation sector accounted for 29% of emissions, the power sector accounted for 28%, and the third source was the industrial sector at 22%. So clearly, if we are hoping to reduce emissions, we need to focus a considerable amount of time and energy on the transportation sector. So if we now look at that sector, it's comprised of three broad segments: ground transportation, aviation, and watercraft. So briefly about ground transportation, there's been a considerable amount of progress, perhaps extraordinary progress over the last 5 years. Tesla has been the tip of the spear, but now many manufacturers in the United States, in Europe, and Asia are developing electric vehicles. So in the consumer market, there are now electric sedans, electric SUVs, soon to be electric pickup trucks. If you look at the commercial market, electric manufacturers are now making commercial vehicles or about to make commercial vehicles in virtually all of the classes, including Class 8, which represents the big 18-wheelers. If you look at the more specialized commercial segments, there are now multiple manufacturers making urban buses, commuter buses, electric garbage trucks, fire trucks, school buses, and so on. So in ground transportation, there has been quite a bit of progress in zero-emission vehicles. Now let's turn to aviation. It may come as a bit of a surprise, but in aviation, there also is quite a bit of progress. And I would describe the situation in aviation as like the situation in ground transportation about 10 years ago. So there are tens of companies in the United States and elsewhere developing electric airplanes, either electric or hybrid electric, and then all electric vertical and takeoff and landing aircraft. So an example would be Wright Electric. Wright Electric just moved their headquarters to New York, to Albany, to take advantage of engineering talent in the state. Wright's developing a 737 class all-electric airplane, which it hopes to enter service in 2030. And per the CEO, Jeffrey Engler, he wrote me that he expects by 2040, routes of up to 1,000 miles to be serviced either by hybrid electric or electric aircraft. And if that comes to pass, then that will help stem the continuing increase of emissions in aviation. And if you're interested in this topic, the Sierra Club will publish a summary of a paper I wrote in the Sierra Atlantic magazine later this spring, or if you want to wade through the paper, you can access it at my website, arden-consulting.com, and it offers some recommendations for New York State legislators to accelerate progress in that sector. Now let's turn to watercraft, the subject of today's seminar. In my opinion, the difference between watercraft and aviation is dramatic. There are a few exceptions, but in general, American companies are not focusing on zero-emission vessels. So where's the progress occurring? In general, the progress in designing, making, and deploying zero-emission watercraft is happening in Northern Europe. So as an example, the Danes last year deployed an all-electric ferry called the Ellen. The Ellen services a route that's 25 miles point to point. It can carry 200 people and up to 30 automobiles, and that is an all-electric ferry, no diesel engines for propulsion or for backup. And that's a considerably sized vessel. And one important point to note, where these advances are happening in Northern Europe is largely in inland waters and in coastal waters, not yet in the open ocean or transoceanic routes. So this raises the question, if in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. If they are making progress, why can't we do the same here in New York State? So now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Kaminsky. Senator Kaminsky represents the 9th Senate District in New York that lies just east of Queens. It includes Rockville Center and Long Beach, so it is a water-facing district. And Senator Kaminsky and his colleague in the Assembly, Assemblymember Engelbright, sponsored the climate bill last year, which was enacted by the legislature and signed into law by Governor Cuomo. The climate bill, or more formally, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, is one of the most ambitious in the United States, and it calls for power generation to be zero emission by 2040, and by 2050, an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to levels in 1990. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce Senator Kaminsky, and he's graciously agreed to spend some time with us this afternoon to talk a bit about the bill and especially what's been going on in Albany since it was enacted in June.
Thanks, Wayne. Am I coming in clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right, that's great. Thank you. I just want to say how important I think that this panel is, even right now, because there is zero discussion on the subject happening. As chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee, I get to be at the cross-section of a lot of different ideas, of a lot of different initiatives, some very bright minds, some very forward thinkers. Wayne is the only person, who's talked to me about electric watercraft, right? I get lots of visits from enterprising companies in Albany who want to site renewable projects, who have the latest battery projects, who want to do all sorts of innovative things, and it's really exciting. But there's been nothing on watercraft at all. And it's really important we begin to think about that when we consider all the commercial and recreational traffic that are on our waterways. I think it's going to be so challenging, but obviously I believe doable because I'm the sponsor of the bill, to reach our renewable goals that are outlined in the CLCPA, that we're going to need every facet of our society to pull its own weight. And so that's not just the electricity generation, but certainly from our industry, certainly from our transportation sector. And within that sector, everyone has to work together. It would be unthinkable right now if there was a whole class of buildings or a whole class of electric generators that had no plan whatsoever to go fossil fuel free just a few decades from now. But that's where we are with marine craft. And I really think it's important that the state begin to engage thinking along those lines and work along those lines. The most important thing that the CLCPA did was set these really aggressive targets, the most aggressive in the country. And those are not just aspirational. We mean to enforce those. And it enacted a climate action council that's going to sit and think up, macro climate policy for the state. And their thoughts will actually become binding regulation in 2024. So the good thing that's happened so far, although a little bit slower than I'd like, but still progress, is we have selected and we have finally promulgated, and they have met. There is a Climate Action Council. They are really, really important. And within the Climate Action Council, there are going to be subcommittees that are going to report to the greater council and help inform them in a non-binding way, but help inform them with certain subject area expertise. So we know that there will be very important gatekeepers, whether they're on a transportation subcommittee or whether they're the Climate Action Council members themselves, who need to know this. So, you have a few points of entry right now if you really want to move climate policy in New York. One is, you still have your elected representatives like me, who aren't going away. We're still a legislature. We still, help pass a budget. We still help pass laws. And so having us know what the latest in these areas and where we can incentivize is important. We have the structure of the state, which is still the agencies that matter, whether that is NYSERDA, whether that's our DEC, and certainly talking to them is a key way to influence policy. But now we have this Climate Action Council that kind of is supposed to sit above all of it. And in fact, one of the two co-chairs of the Climate Action Council is the DEC commissioner and the leader of NYSERDA, who right now is Alicia Barton. So having members of the council understand this area, understand where it's lacking, and understand where it needs to go is really important. And of course, there is a big overlap. A lot of the governor's agency heads sit on the Climate Action Council, and some of the industry leaders sit on the Climate Action Council, and some of the environmental justice leading advocates sit on the Climate Action Council. But we want to get this talk out there. We want to get it in the air. We want to get people thinking. And of course, we want our leaders in government to start setting some incentives to get people to want to invest and work in this area. So setting this off today, setting off the spark, setting off these conversations, I think is dramatically important because it's too important of an area to have gone ignored. So I'd like, to be part of this, and I'd appreciate hearing all your thoughts on this. And then once we're done with this, we got to start, setting out some real action to get to get our thoughts across and to get the goals across that need to be reached. So I'm really happy to be here, Wayne. Want to do whatever I can in this important sector as someone who lives a block from the ocean, who lives a few blocks from the Reynolds Channel. I grew up in kind of a semi-maritime community. I certainly grew up on an island, knowing that we're going to be doing everything we can in one area, but still having diesel fumes pouring out of our boats and ships is crazy. So we got to do good work on this, and I hope these conversations today help underlie what we're able to do in the future.
Terrific. One follow-up question for you. Do you think it's a fair statement that when lawmakers and their staffs did the calculations underlying the bill, that they didn't think that there would be significant reductions in emissions from either aviation or watercraft? Is that?
I think they were hoping something could be done, but no one was counting on them. And I think that you'll actually see that in a lot of thinking on the CLCPA. I think there is some type of leap of faith that we took, which is we don't know what future technology will be able to get us to, but we know we have to incentivize it in every way we can, demand that it be done with every fiber of our being, and set our creative forces loose. So I don't think anyone thought it's impossible. I think this area, frankly, suffers from people not thinking about it at all. But I do think that we want to do everything we can in every area whatsoever to help us reach those goals.
Terrific. Well, we'll have some thoughts for you towards the end of the seminar, and I understand that you've got another commitment, but Steve, your Director of Communications, will be with us, and so we'll have some suggestions of how to advance the situation. All right, that's terrific. With that introduction, I think we'll move on to the panelists. And we have 4 panelists today that offer differing perspectives about watercraft. And I'd like to start with the Waterfront Alliance and Karen Imas, who is Senior Director of Programs at the Waterfront Alliance. When I was doing some homework regarding the seminar, I met with the Waterfront Alliance and interacted with some of the operators here in New York City. And it became absolutely clear that the Waterfront Alliance is a clearinghouse of knowledge about the maritime industry, both in the city and the state, and that most of the operators here work closely with the Waterfront Alliance. So it's terrific that Karen can be with us and provide us an overview of the industry and why it's so important to New York City and New York State.
Thanks, Wayne. I'm gonna open my presentation here for a moment. Here we go. So thanks, everyone, and good to be with you this afternoon. My name is Karen Imas, and I'm the Senior Program Director with the Waterfront Alliance. And I'll help set the stage a little bit on New York State's maritime sector. Really to echo Senator Kaminsky's remarks, not many people are really thinking about this sector. It a little bit operates behind a curtain. As the public, we don't really engage with the working waterfront or the maritime sector very much and understand its day-to-day workings. Who are the actors? What are the challenges and opportunities they face? And certainly in a conversation around sustainability, this is an incredibly important sector to look at. So a little bit about the Waterfront Alliance, who we are. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization working in New York and New Jersey that works on inspiring and affecting resilient, revitalized, accessible coastlines for all communities. We are really at the intersection of all things that are waterfront in the region. And to just touch on that a little bit more, what do we work on? We work on coastal resilience and adaptation, ensuring that there's a strong and robust protected waterfront. We work on healthy coastlines and water quality issues. We work on open and publicly accessible waterfronts for all communities, equitable access. And the fourth bucket being the working waterfront. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail today. Just a couple of highlights around our work and advocacy in this space. And thanks, Wayne, for mentioning our network of maritime and working waterfront partners. We are really always going to bat for the economic viability and importance of this sector. Also recognizing that sustainability of the sector is important for our communities and for the future of the sector in this region. We've done a lot of work partnering with the Department of City Planning in New York on its comprehensive waterfront plan, which has studied issues ranging from shore power to short sea shipping in the region. We've been a leading advocate for keeping Red Hook Terminal open and active in Brooklyn. We've taken a leadership role on different working groups, working with the Coast Guard and the Maritime Association, have been a leading voice for NYC Ferry, which has been an extraordinary success story. And now, and most recently, really a leading advocate for the growth of the offshore wind sector in the region, which is really becoming an important conversation in Long Island, in the New York Harbor, and around the Port of Albany as well. So really a statewide opportunity. And just a few snapshots of some of this recent advocacy we've done, partnering with the General Contractors Association of New York, looking at how to highlight offshore wind as a key economic driver for the region and our ports. Certainly a whole new category of maritime vessels are going to be servicing this industry in the not too distant future, thanks to the CLCPA. And also very locally advocating for the next round of ferry landings that will be coming to New York City in 2021. And I'll talk a little bit more about NYC Ferry further into the presentation. I wanted to highlight this slide for a moment before diving into some of the statistics about how maritime plays a critical role during a crisis. The last 20 years in New York, we've seen 9/11, we've seen Hurricane Sandy, we've survived a blackout, and here we are today under these really challenging and uncertain circumstances with COVID-19. Our ports and our working waterfront and our maritime assets play an incredibly critical role. And you could see some of the diversity of vessels that are playing this role in terms of emergency preparedness, everything from tugboats to ferries to the fire boats to the Coast Guard are very apparent in New York Harbor and across the state, and become more apparent when we are faced with a time of crisis and we need to move more people or more goods on the water. The floating hospital that docked on the west side of Manhattan just a week ago is a key example of that. And there are really very few places in Manhattan where you could dock a vessel of this nature. Just a few snapshot numbers here around what do we have in terms of vessels across New York State. Tugboats, towboats, barges, and ferries. This is kind of a sort of a general overview of the kinds of vessels we're looking at. And vessels on New York waterways are moving an incredible amount of freight every year, 28 million tons of domestic freight, ranging from manufactured goods to chemical and petroleum products. Our tugboats and towboats play an incredibly important role for the large container ships that are coming into the harbor. That's upwards of 5,000 container ships annually. Petroleum and petroleum products on some of the smaller barges are what we see moving across the waterways. This is everything from New York Harbor up and down the Hudson. And then we have many different ferry systems in New York. NYC Ferry may be sort of the most pronounced, but Long Island has a number of ferries, and up to Lake Champlain, we see a number of ferries. We have Maid of the Mist around Niagara Falls. So this is a very diverse picture of the kind of maritime vessels we have in the state. And moving goods on water still remains the most efficient form of transportation, but obviously there's a lot of room for improvement and growth in terms of sustainability. And here you can see a graphic that just kind of shows the CO2 emissions comparably across different forms of transportation. A couple of key stats around the sector and its economic contribution to the state. The Port of New York and New Jersey, which is, you know, a unique entity because we're talking about New York Harbor, which is by state, has an economic footprint of 400,000 total jobs in the region. This ranges from everything from our port workforce to our maritime vessels to the related industries like logistics and warehousing and shipping that are tied to this sector. More directly, New York State's waterways and ports support 150,000 jobs, and that's 32 billion contributed to the state's economy. A small microcosm of that is NYC Ferry, which we've seen grow here locally in the city. 28 vessels built and operated by Hornblower, with more than 450 employees and continuing to grow. And just a snapshot of the job opportunities that we think about when we're talking about vessels, maritime vessels. Offshore wind, which I mentioned, which is going to be both a challenge and opportunity in terms of the number of maritime vessels and crafts we have available to move the parts out into the harbor, growing the NYC ferry system, shipyards, and increasing conversations around short sea shipping, which touch on the notion of truck congestion in our region, creating a parallel marine highway for I-95, but also just inner harbor and Long Island shipping, moving smaller barges with smaller freight from small ports across the region. And so the zero emission vessel conversation is certainly a tremendous opportunity and definitely one that really hasn't been discussed in a thorough and meaningful way in the region or really in the country. A lot of opportunities and challenges in this space. The maritime industry is complicated by a number of outside pressures. There's an extraordinary amount of congestion in the harbor. A lot of red tape and regulations. If you talk to many of the, especially smaller operators, the smaller tug companies or tour boat operators will tell you the difficulty of dealing with a multitude of city, state, and federal agencies. And in the denser parts of the state, the scarcity of real estate for industrial and maritime uses. Some of our smaller maritime operators pay for their own dredging and bulkhead repair, which is very costly. And there's port competition across the East Coast and globally. And I think this confluence of factors at times creates a sensitivity to change in the sector. And I think that's kind of where we find ourselves at this sort of moment in time. There's certainly, I think, an extraordinary opportunity with the focus on sustainability, the appetite for the public to use and to see cleaner vessels in their waterways, to have this conversation now. This is going to require collaboration across sectors and agencies. There are certainly opportunities to pilot programs and stagger implementation. We've seen this done on the vehicle side with municipal agencies passing legislation to have like parks vehicles be clean or electric school buses. And so there are certainly pockets of the maritime industry where piloting might make a lot of sense as a starting point. And of course, the cost benefit analysis of how this would work on short distances versus long distances and speeds of various routes. All that to say, this is already being played with here in New York State. The Maid of the Mist is launching the first all-electric one of the first all-electric passenger vessels in North America. Here are a couple of just stats on how it's going to operate. I think it's expected to launch next year. And I think there's still some TBDs with that, but you can see some of the work being done on it, which will be an extraordinary, I think, opportunity for New York State to showcase being front of the pack, as it often is on green issues, but also to show the public what's possible with a vessel of this nature. So I'll stop there and let some of the other panelists get a little more in the weeds on the technical side of things. And thank you, and happy to answer questions throughout the webinar. Back to you, Wayne.
Thank you, Karen. I just have one follow-up question for you. Are you aware of any pilots going on with some of the operators here in metropolitan New York, or perhaps up and down the Hudson? Are you aware of any pilots?
I'm not aware of pilots in a total zero emissions capacity. I know that there have been efforts by certain operators to look at hybrid vessels. Even the Staten Island ferry had looked at cleaner burning fuels, pilot programs with cleaner burning fuels, but not a pilot program that is totally zero emissions.
Okay. All right. Well, let's keep going forward. Next, I'd like to introduce Dan Steingart. Professor Steingart is with the Columbia School of Engineering and Applied Science. He is co-director of the Electrochemical Energy Center. And this topic is of particular interest to Professor Steingart and to the engineering school at Columbia, because the Electrochemical Energy Center and a sister organization at Columbia, the Global Center for Energy Policy, sponsored a workshop last November. And I believe some members of our audience attended that workshop. And that workshop was titled Prospects for Marine Electrification and Decarbonization. So Professor Steingart has agreed to talk with us a bit about his thoughts about decarbonization in this sector.
Unmute. Thank you so much, Wayne. Let me try sharing my screen and making it full screen. There's a question from the audience, Wayne. Should we hold back?
Yeah, that's a
okay.
Point of order. We're going to try to get through the panelist discussions, and then we'll conduct a poll, and then we'll leave. Then we'll reserve time for questions.
Okay. So again, thanks everyone for the time. I hope everyone is at home and safe. Can everyone see my screen, full screen? It's looking okay. Excellent. Well, so a bit of a shameless plug about me and what I do. I'm a professor in the departments of Earth Environmental Engineering and Chemical Engineering. Along with my colleague Alan West, I co-direct the Columbia Electrochemical Energy Center. We are 10 faculty and 1 research director, and we cover everything that's required to bring fundamental science to actual practice for electrochemical energy storage, with the mission of accelerating the adoption of electrochemical energy storage for the benefit of humanity. 10 years ago, I've been working on batteries for 20 years, since I was a graduate student. 10 years ago, when I started my first faculty position at City College of New York, the question was if energy storage would make a difference for decarbonization. 10 years later, I'm happy to say it's a when. So instead of asking the question, what can we do? Now the question is, how fast can we do it? What are the problems that are somewhere between fundamental science and applied engineering that can help get us there? And so I've stolen a term I read about just a few months ago called fundamental engineering. And I think that's what we need to get done to really accelerate how and where we can use energy storage. First, to talk about batteries. Batteries are overcoupled. And what I mean by overcoupled is when you make one thing better in a battery, if you're not careful, you can make 4, 5, or 6 things worse. I use this framework I call the unfortunate tetrahedron to explain this. And the idea here is that we have this pyramid, and on each vertex of this pyramid, we see a different battery that represents, for lack of a better word, the platonic ideal for that metric, but it's not particularly good in any of the other metrics. So for example, I care a lot about capital cost in my research, and that's why I put that at the top of the pyramid. but and the AA battery represents probably the best capital cost one can get for a battery, $20 per kilowatt hour, but you can only use it once. On the lower left-hand corner, we have our trusty marine lead acid battery that is probably the safest battery to operate cheaply at sea now, soon to be displaced by lithium ion. But lithium ion isn't quite there for seafaring applications yet. And then we have the iron phosphate battery for power density and a lithium metal battery for energy density. And each one of these represents the best in class on that point on the pyramid. But what we want is a battery that does all of these things really well. And the reason why we have 10 people in our center, or 10 faculty in our center, is that understanding what the trade-offs are physically between these different points is crucial for accelerating adoption. With marine electrification, I started looking at marine electrification a few years ago when a student in one of my classes when I taught at Princeton came to me and started a summer project in this. And I always thought that vessels would be efficient, but the problem with vessels is that they not only have drag through air, but they have drag through water, and drag through water is a real drag, pardon the pun. Here we have on the left efficiencies, relative efficiencies in terms of miles traveled per kilowatt hour. Right, so kilowatt hour is the way we think about storage of a battery. And for an optimistic passenger EV, this is the really good number Elon Musk puts out. If you drive very conservatively, you can get 4 miles per kilowatt hour traveled for a passenger EV. And the beauty of this calculation is that it tracks pretty well between any available EV or plug-in EV out there now. So my 2014 Prius plug-in hybrid gets about the same if I drive it very conservatively. We see right away that this number gets cut down by a factor of 8 when we go to a Class 7 or Class 8 semi-truck. For a ferry, and I'm not going to go too much into ferries because we won't hear about this yet, this takes another big hit. And what I'm concerned with most for reducing carbon emissions is how one displaces tankers and cargo ships. And those barely register here. And it's not 50 miles per gallon, but rather 50 gallons per mile at best for these types of applications. The picture on the right is a hobby I just learned about, which is one, people go surfing in Galveston, right? So this isn't an ocean, this is Galveston, Texas. And people go surfing in the wakes of these large ships there. So these ships are dragging so much water, you can catch nice waves. So what does this mean? Well, here's a math lesson. So I've been doing a lot of remote teaching and it continues today. Let's take the stretch battery energy density for a battery that's available now. It's 300 watt-hours per kilogram. This is maybe possible today with a lot of effort, right? This is a non-trivial number to achieve, but we're within striking distance of this for a pack level system. So here is an optimistic fuel estimate for a cargo ship. Basically, if I take that 50 gallon per mile number that I've seen cited in multiple places, we get a real fraction of a mile per kilowatt hour. So that's that blip on the curve that we get. So how much battery would we need to do something useful? Well, we want to go across the ocean, right? So this is our real stretch for our stretch battery. So we get 1.66 times 10 to the minus 4 miles per kilogram. A ship going from New York City to London is 3,495 miles. So the battery I would need for this trip is a little over 23,000 metric tons. So 23,000 metric tons is effectively the entire capacity of that ship if we wanted to go across the country. So here you see the challenge, right? Because the joke in Class 7, Class 8 vehicles is that the only thing left over after you have all the battery in the vehicle is room for potato chips. So if we were going to have a ship that only was sending potato chips to and from New York and London, this battery would do it. How far can this go? Well, if we look at the batteries that we just heard about, so this is maybe the future energy density. This is a real asymptote, 500 watt-hours per kilogram. I have no idea how to make this battery now. I might in 5 or 6 or 7 years. At this point, if we can almost double the energy density, then it looks a little bit better. We have almost 50% of the room left over. So batteries alone aren't going to do it, but there is hope. And so a fuel cell, which is like a battery, but instead of having all of the storage in one place, you feed fuel in. It can have, it behaves in the same way current vehicles do, because current vehicles work and they get done what we need to get done, and that's the challenge of displacing fossil fuels. But it can run from green H2, and making green H2 is non-trivial, but there are pathways there, or some stored version of green H2. The fuel cell is basically ready. There's certainly room for improvement, and the fuel cell is equivalent to the engine itself. But 50 years in engineering, largely led by the Navy, has this reactor in pretty good shape. The current thing is, how do you store hydrogen in an effective manner? And there are ways of doing it, but the problem isn't so much technical feasibility, but cost. So sorry, here's some more math. If I have a carbon fiber tank and I need to use carbon fiber because hydrogen rusts steel. So the problem is that the boat would start out, or the ship would start out in New York, and then by the time it got to New York, it would be effectively corroded through. So the total tank cost for this would be almost $100 million. So there are ways of doing this cheaper. We can use ammonia, and fuel cells leveraging ammonia exist. And so in routes between Japan and Australia now, this may be the way of getting it done. If we can manufacture ammonia using green fuels, using really low cost electricity, this is pretty exciting. So I don't want to depress you, but I just want to explain how hard it was. There are a lot of applications for batteries that can be used now. For example, cold iron support. This is when a battery, when a ship is at shore. Ships at shore have a lot of nasty emissions beyond CO2. NOx and SOx are quite bad. So around New York, if there was regulation basically saying we wanted all electric operation within 20 or 50 miles of shore, this is possible in near term and hybridized configurations. More research is required to better define these opportunities. So I'll leave it with electric long-haul cargo is possible with fuel cells and with batteries as hybrid support, but it's currently way too expensive. More fundamental research funding is required to tackle these. This is a shameless plea because this is what I do for a living, but effectively we have not done the same level of research understanding this application as we have for electric vehicles and now aviation. Thanks so much for your time.
All right, thank you, Professor Steingart. Just one follow-up question. According to various pundits, the predictions are that energy density of batteries will double in the next 10 years by 2030. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, would help. That would extend the distance where zero-emission crafts could be functional. Do you think that prediction is on point, or too aggressive, or too conservative? What are your thoughts there?
So doubling, so this gets into the weeds a bit. Doubling the energy density of the cell, I think within a decade, if research funding continues the way it does, is possible. It's not guaranteed, but it's certainly possible. There's a chemical pathway there. But there's a lot of stuff that has to go around that core innovation of doubling the energy density of the cell. So doubling the energy density of the pack, which is all the batteries put together and all the ancillaries you need for it, may be a stretch. And so that's why I went from 300 to 500 in my calculation. But point taken, even if we double it, batteries alone will become almost guaranteed for ferries, like we'll hear now. But for long haul, we're going to have to bring in fuel cells.
Got it. Okay. So if I summarize, the prospects for zero-emission watercraft in coastal waters and inland waters is reasonably good in the near term, mm-hmm. But for transoceanic applications, there's some pretty tough challenges.
That's right. I would say they're not right. They're technically feasible. We just have to put the resources into solving these problems, right? This is not a fusion level problem by any stretch. Physically, it's easier than trying to get a 1,000-mile aircraft, but we just need to have the effort to get this done.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, let's now turn to a practitioner. I thought it was quite important to have on the panel someone who is building zero-emission watercraft. So Hans Thornell is joining us from Stockholm, Sweden. Hans is the founder and CEO of Green City Ferries, and he is a naval architect and was lieutenant commander in the Swedish Navy. So his life has been immersed in the maritime industry. And just if you haven't been to Stockholm, first, it's a beautiful city, but Stockholm is situated on the mainland and 14 islands, and it's on the edge of the Stockholm archipelago, which consists of 24,000 islands, which extend to the east, north, and south of the city. So Stockholm is very much a maritime city and has an extensive ferry network of its own. So with those words of introduction, Hans, if you could talk to us a little bit about what Green City Ferries is doing.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say that we follow what's happening in New York, and you have a much worse situation than we have in Stockholm. I hope that the trend from yesterday we heard about will stay, and I wish you all a good health.
Thank you.
Now going to my presentation. Oh, hold on, coming up. You see it? No.
Not yet.
There it is. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Very good. I'm going to talk about the development of high-speed ferries. And this is what I'm going to talk about. First of all, what's up in Scandinavia. Then a little bit about the company Green City Ferries and the vessel, which is called BB Green, stands for Battery Boat Green. And then I'm going to talk about economy. I call it the green economy. And finally, a little bit about strategic approach to the issue. Now, what's up in Scandinavia? Going back to 2015, Norway got its first supercharged all-electric car ferry. It's called Ampere, with extra battery pack on shore to compensate for a very weak grid. Since then, another electric 80 car ferries have been ordered. Norway is actually leading the race, and 50% of all marine batteries are going to Norway. Of the world, all production of marine batteries is 50% to Norway. Now, some years later, Sweden got its first supercharged all-electric big ferries, to Aurora and the Tycho Brahe, carrying 1,250 passengers and 240 cars, charging in less than 10 minutes. And then the following year, as you mentioned, Wayne, Denmark got its first all-electric car and passenger ferry, Ellen, with a range of 22 nautical miles. Now, going closer into cities, what's up in Scandinavian cities? Well, this year, Damen Shipyards will deliver 7 all-electric city ferries to Copenhagen. Fast and frequent charging 17 times per day. So they need batteries that can stand so many chargings. In Stockholm, we're working on a transition strategy that is taking shape on how to transform a fleet of 50 old vessels and start up of 3 different pilots. I will come back to that. Now back to Norway again. All waterborne public transport on the Oslo fjord must use renewable energy from 2020. 3 big ferries have been retrofitted last year and 5 new will be delivered next year. And I can mention also that Norway didn't focus so much on climate change because they had problems with nitrogen, NOx, because that is very harmful to people's health. And so is the particles that are generated from the emissions from diesel engines. So, Green City Ferries, here's a short story. In 2014, actually the year before Ampere, ES Movits was the world's first supercharged passenger ferry that operates for an hour and recharges in 10 minutes. Now remember, this is 6 years ago, and by then, nobody could imagine batteries on ships. And when we said we can recharge in 10 minutes, that was a story that went around the world. 2 years later, we introduced the BB Green. We had been working on it since 2012. And this was a prototype built in Riga in Latvia. This was the world's fastest supercharged passenger ferry that could operate at 30 knots, only on batteries. And this boat in the commercial version could take about 80 passengers. After that, we had to work on a commercial version, and we had actually to develop a new battery system. We have the existing batteries that are called NMC in the chemistry were not good enough. We need very fast charging and long life. So we had something called LTO, lithium titanate oxide batteries. And we had to develop that because there were no marine version of it. Now the BB Green 24 is the scale up of the prototype, and it takes about 147 passengers plus bikes, can make 35 knots, charges in less than 10 minutes, and lifetime for the battery is over 10 years. Now let's look at the technology behind the BB Green. First of all, the material is carbon fiber. And here we have the Swedish Navy corvette Visby is made of carbon fiber. And the whole design is made by Anders Lönne. He is our CTO. And he is a real expert on carbon fiber. And carbon fiber is about 30% lighter in a ship than aluminum. Second technology thing is the air-supported vessel. If you look at the vessel on the picture there, you can see in the back there's an opening in the black area. A fan in the front blows air into a cavity under the vessel. And the vessel is planing on the air cushion, resulting in 40% less energy consumption than the normal carbon fiber catamarans. And thirdly, high-performance LTO batteries. These batteries, they can charge 3 times faster than the common NMC batteries, and they have 5 times longer life than the NMC batteries. Now, getting into the good circle, and this is the idea. By reducing the energy consumption, it will be possible to use batteries, and thereby reducing the energy consumption, actually even more. Now, I will show you the mathematics. Sorry, mathematics again. The fact is that BB Green uses 80% less energy than the common catamarans of today. First, if you look at the material, to go from aluminum to carbon fiber makes the vessel much lighter, 30% lighter, and we use 15% less energy. Now, if you make the hull design, not a catamaran, but an ASV hull, we can cut another 40%. And if you go to the driveline, instead of diesel, we go to batteries. You see, the problem with diesel is that only 1/3 of the energy in the diesel is used for propulsion. 2/3 is used to heat up the engine room. So it's quite an inefficient way, this combustion things. Batteries, on the other hand, use maybe 90 or 95% of the energy. If you put all these together, we get an 80% reduction of energy. And that, of course, has a great impact on the cost. Let's have a comparison between, in real life, between two different vessels. First, we had a Swedish vessel, but I realized we must have the one in New York. And I'm not so sure about the consumption, but we made an estimate from similar catamarans. And we expect it to be about 3.2 US gallons per nautical mile, which compares to 120 kilowatt hour per nautical mile. That is in 25 knots. If we look at the BB Green, 149 passenger BB Green vessel uses about 26 kilowatt hours per nautical mile. You see the difference is almost 80% less. Now, if it transform this into money, and we do the assumption that we have 2,000 hours of operations per year, and 3.2 US gallons and 25 knots. And the price per gallon is $2.75. That will make the cost of energy consumption to $440,000 per year. If you look at the BB Green, 2,000 hours per year, 26 kilowatt hours, 25 knots, and the price of 12 cents per kilowatt hour results in an annual cost of $156,000 per year. So it's almost $300,000 less cost in energy, and some of it is also in maintenance. I would say that's close to the capital cost to buy a new boat. Here's another example. I had a lecture once, and there was someone who asked me, why do you have to travel so fast? I mean, we can read on it and work on the boat and so on. And I thought about that, and I made a calculation. This is a Swedish vessel, and it consumes 130 kilowatt hours per nautical mile, making 11 knots. And compare that with the high-speed BB Green vessel that uses 26 kilowatt hours. Now, what about this? Well, the BB Green 24 with 20 knots average speed transports the same volume with the same frequency as two slow vessels at 10 knots at much lower cost. Less maintenance, less crew, only one vessel, less energy consumption, and for the passengers, it's shorter travel time. So it is said that speed always costs. I wouldn't say that. You have to make the calculation to see that in this case, speed is very much cheaper. So the question when in the transition into a, let's say, green world, the question is not really what to do with the new technology, but rather what to do with the old technology. And that's what's stopping the transition in many cases. What should we do with our ships? In Stockholm, we are working on a strategy now, and what we said is, how would the fleet look like in 2030, 10 years from now? And we found that we would have new high-speed vessels because of economy. Well, they're emission-free as well. And then we have, as number 3, retrofitted vessels, small city vessels that are crossing a river or something. But the old vessels, this is a beauty. It's actually a steam vessel from 1898. But we can use them for peak shaving. And with peak shaving, I mean, there are seasonal differences. For example, in Stockholm Archipelago, Friday afternoon, a lot of passengers compared to the rest of the week. Or maybe in wintertime, we have a problem here called ice. And when we have ice, we cannot use high-speed ferries. But we can use the old ones for 2 months or something. So first, new high-speed vessels, emission-free and standardized, making more than 25 knots. They will go on batteries, but there's a limit up to 15 nautical miles. Over that, we need to have fuel cells, but that's doable. And the older peak shaving vessels, they can use biofuel, a scarce product, but they can use it. And the older slow speed vessels, they can be retrofitted. They're steel vessels, but as they're going so slow because they don't need to go fast when they just cross a river, they can be retrofitted with batteries. So the transition to having green city ferries needs a clear strategy and also a pilot to get started. You know, seeing is believing. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. But just a point of clarification. So the example you gave that was specific to New York City, you used an electricity rate, I think it was 12 cents per kilowatt hour. That rate is from the EIA, the Department of Energy's Energy Information Agency, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So that
Mid-Atlantic.
It's a commercial rate. It's not a residential rate, but it is applicable to New York City.
Yes, it is. It's a Mid-Atlantic.
Okay. All right. And then one additional point. I just did the quick math. So what you found was that the operating cost would be 35% with your boat versus a traditional one. And just a comparison, you mentioned the Damon Shipyard Group. They have sold an all-electric tugboat to the ports of Auckland in New Zealand. It's a very big tugboat. It's among the biggest in the world. It's 70 metric tons of bollard pull, which is a specialized measure for the tugboat industry. But there are just a few tugboats in New York City that are bigger. And what the ports of Auckland is saying is that they anticipate that operating costs of the new all-electric tugboat will be 1/3 of their current diesel tugboats. So your numbers are consistent with theirs.
Yeah.
And by the way, they're projecting savings of about $18 million New Zealand over the life of the tugboat, which works out to 10.6 million US dollars, which is pretty significant.
Yeah, but what we say is for the high-speed ferry, it's 80% less energy consumption. But then we have the price of the energy, whether it's electric or it's diesel, and it's depending on what are the taxes.
Right.
We still have tax in Stockholm, but Norway took it away.
Okay.
So there's a big difference.
Yeah, your example will vary in every location based on the cost of fuel, electricity, taxes, and so on. But the savings are substantial just because of the 80% efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Now let's turn to the Sierra Club. Do we have Roger with us?
I'm here. I don't know if you can see me.
Wonderful. Okay, just a brief introduction. Roger Downs is the Conservation Director for the Sierra Club Atlantic Chapter. He resides in Albany and interacts with a lot of lawmakers and has the pulse of all things happening related to the environment in Albany, I think. And Roger, if you could conclude our panelists' discussion by offering some thoughts on the climate bill and any thoughts you may have about this specific topic about zero-emission watercraft.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Wayne. I think what we've heard today is incredibly illuminating, especially the promise represented in all those Scandinavian ferries. Really incredible. And I'd like to get as quickly to questions of our experts as possible. But before that, I thought I would maybe expand a little bit on Senator Kaminsky's remarks and give a very quick look at how the electrification of our marine fleets fits into New York's policy and legislative realm, and how we begin to convert the information we've learned today into meaningful action. So as was discussed previously on the webinar, New York passed last year the nation's most ambitious climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. This law requires that the state supply all its electricity from renewable and carbon neutral sources by 2040 and reduce greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors 85% by 2050. And, I'll say from my perspective, during the negotiations for the climate bill, those of us who were pushing maybe a little too ambitiously back against offset programs and seeking a 100% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 ran up against the presumption that the state of New York has little direct power over certain sectors like interstate truck traffic, the emissions from the airline industries, and the emissions of ferries, ships, tugs, and barges, especially ones that leave New York waters. And I think all of us gave up too easily on some of the sectors we thought would be too difficult to change, and instead devised a program to offset those emissions. And that's represented in that last 15% that would be offset in some other way through carbon farming, soil amendments, agroforestry, reduction of certain greenhouse gas chemicals and other industrial processes. And I think from what we've heard today, that simply is not the case. And we do have some capacity to bring the electrification of our maritime fleets to New York and subsequently find even more emissions reductions capacity. So the New York State Legislature and Governor Cuomo just passed a budget last Friday under extremely different circumstances due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But even in that chaos, the state still passed a number of important climate initiatives, like the $3 billion Environmental Bond Act to finance climate resiliency projects, and a new renewable energy siting law that removes previous administrative barriers and a lot of red tape and jumpstarts the exponential growth of solar and wind farms. So if it wasn't clear, the appetite to act on climate in New York is still continuing and is very much here in the present. And I think we can really tackle this issue. The State Department of Environmental Conservation, as a result of the passage of the new climate law, as Senator Kaminsky just talked about, is also undergoing the arduous task of creating the rules and regulations, if not the blueprint, to guide this transition to a renewable energy-based society. This process will conclude in 2024, and I think the Climate Action Council that's overseeing this process would be keen on integrating what we've learned today, knowing that it's possible, and really integrate, especially what we've heard about, at least the short trips with ferries, into their overall planning and the way that they're looking at the transportation sector. Some of the early things that the Sierra Club is looking at, and I think a lot of colleagues, to advance the electrification of New York's maritime fleets are both setting legislative or executive mandates, just kind of the stick, and then creating incentives and funding streams for pilot programs and the procurement of electric vehicles, which is more of the carrot. The climate law certainly covers the transportation sector, which represents, by our calculation, 30% of New York's greenhouse gas emissions, as an area of obligation for the state to reduce emissions. though I would say the climate law is admittedly the weakest and most vague in the transportation sector. We don't have the same mandates and tools that other sectors do. But there's hope. You know, earlier this year, the governor announced that he would be directing 5 of the largest upstate and suburban transit systems to electrify 25% of their bus fleets by 2025 and 100% by 2030. And had not the legislative session ended so abruptly this year, the Senate and Assembly were keen on passing a measure to require that passenger fleet vehicles purchased by or for the state or public authorities must be zero emissions by 2030. And we have good reason to believe that that can pass next year. So in the same vein, it doesn't feel that inconceivable to mandate that the state requires that every new public ferry and vessel purchased in New York must also be all electric by 2030. Beyond the lack of mandates, another huge barrier to realizing our transportation climate goals is lack of revenue streams to fund the transition from the internal combustion engine to all electric motors. New York is currently on the cusp of joining what is called the Transportation Climate Initiative. This is a 13-state agreement to cap on-road transportation emissions, mostly from cars and trucks. It will then auction credits under that cap to those that produce and supply transportation fuels, and then direct the proceeds towards clean transportation projects. It seems like a logical extension to consider capping maritime transport emissions as well, and using the same multi-state compact to generate revenue for the electrification of ferries and tugs and other vessels. And in New York State, the state and federal rebates have been effective in helping bringing price parity between electric cars and their gasoline counterparts. Could a rebate on electric engines for smaller working boats and pleasure craft be as effective in guiding the transition to greener vehicles? I think so. And I think all these ideas and more are what we're going to be looking at for the 2021 legislative session. And certainly we'd welcome ideas and collaboration on how to get this done. So Wayne, I'll turn it back to you to facilitate questions, and I'm happy to talk about the Albany dynamic. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, we have one more thing to do before we go to the audience for questions, and we'll ask, we have a poll to 3 different propositions we'd like the audience to consider. And your comments were a perfect lead into that, because you refer to a few of these propositions, and these are steps that New York State could take to accelerate the transition to adoption of zero-emission watercraft. Clearly, I'm not a neutral party here, but New York State could be a leader. Think about the state. We've got one of the nation's most important navigable rivers, the Hudson River. We've got hundreds of miles of shoreline on the Long Island Sound, the Atlantic, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. We've got thousands of lakes. So if New York State takes action, then other states may be influenced and may follow. So Sean, let's try the first proposition, if you can bring it up.
Okay, give me 1 second.
All right. Now what I'll try to do is frame these a little bit. So before you and the audience vote, I'd like to, on this one, I'd like to give you 3 points of reference. The first is that the Mayor of New York, Mayor de Blasio, in his State of the City address, said that by 2040, New York City will have 100% zero-emission fleets. And in his description of zero-emission fleets, he included ferries. So if you work backwards from that date, at some point, the City of New York needs to start purchasing zero-emission ferries. And so that point could be 2030, because it's going to take a while to get to 100% of the fleet being zero emission. So that's one reference point. The second reference point is the MTA has committed to, starting in 2029, buying only zero emission buses. So this date of 2030 for watercraft is consistent with what the MTA is doing for buses. And then lastly, Washington State is taking more aggressive action. Governor Inslee issued an executive order in December directing the transportation agency in Washington State to start buying only zero-emission ferries. So this proposition is less aggressive than what Washington State is doing. So with that introduction, let's see what people think.
Okay, let's see.
And we panelists are not allowed to vote. So are results beginning to come in here?
Yeah, give me 1
Let's
second.
give it another few seconds. Shouldn't take too long. Okay, well, that was a fairly strong result. All right, let's put the second question up there.
Okay.
So while you're doing that, the first proposition would apply to government-owned or funded entities, such as New York City's Economic Development Corporation. But of course, a number of the watercraft in New York City and New York State are operated by commercial operators. And what we've learned is that once the transition to zero-emission watercraft happens, the operating costs are lower. But that transition involves some expenditure because in general, the equivalent zero-emission watercraft are more expensive than their diesel counterparts. And there's a one-time cost of building in the electrical charging infrastructure. So New York State has an authority, the Energy Research and Development Authority, that has a program called Charge New York that is helping build out the infrastructure to charge electric vehicles. And so one step the state could take is to extend that program to watercraft, and via either low-cost loans or grants, help the commercial operators make this transition, especially with the one-time cost of electrical infrastructure. And there is a funding mechanism for this. New York State gets from its cap and trade program, RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. In the current budget, around 118 million is what's projected for fiscal year 21-22. That rises to 131 million. And of course, there are many more ideas than funding, but potentially NYSERDA could direct some of those funds to an effort to help the commercial operators make this transition. So this question then is addressed to a step New York State could take to help the commercial operators. So let's give it 30 seconds or so. And then while we're waiting for this, we have one more question that's directed on the consumer market segment.
Yeah, I'm about to share these results as well for the poll too. So give
Okay.
me 1 second.
All right. Very strong result.
Yeah.
All right, let's move to the third question. This really addresses the consumer market segment. And we haven't spoken about that segment quite as much. There are a handful of companies in the United States that are working on electric propulsion systems for consumer boats. One of them is based in New York, Elco Motor Yachts out of Athens, New York, right on the Hudson. And so as part of the equation to try to create a market that will motivate American boat builders to invest, to go out to banks and venture capitalists and other sources of funding and invest in zero-emission watercraft, the idea is we've got a chicken and egg problem that we need to solve. So NYSERDA also has a program called Drive Clean, and Drive Clean offers a $2,000 rebate to consumers that buy electric vehicles, up to a $2,000 rebate. And potentially this could be expanded to include Boat Clean, where consumers would receive a similar rebate for watercraft intended for inland or close to shore waters. And those tend to be boats of 25 feet or less in length. And let me offer a counter argument, and that is that the situation is analogous. So electric vehicles are essential for some New Yorkers because they don't have good access to public transportation, so they need electric vehicles to get to their jobs and shopping and so on, whereas boats are a luxury item, and the government perhaps should not be subsidizing a luxury item. And I think that argument has merit, but what I would say is that the greater good, at least in the immediate future, is to try to stimulate this market, to try to persuade American boat makers to jump into the market, increase their investments. And that once this program gets underway and the market share of electric watercraft gets to a certain level, then this program could be curtailed. So that would be my my response to that potential objection. So let's now see what people think about this idea. Okay, give it a little bit of time.
Yeah, give me a second.
Yeah, this is an exercise in participatory democracy here. And I think Senator Kaminsky has another commitment, but his Director of Communications, Steve Smriti, is with us. And Steve, admittedly, this is not a random sample of voters from the 9th District or New York State, but still, we're getting some input on what people think might be possible.
Yeah, it's great. I'll definitely, relay all this information back to Senator Kaminsky, and then, we can assess steps moving forward.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
So, Sean, do you have results for that last poll question?
Yeah, let me just refresh it. I just put it up now. Let me know if you see it. Give it a second.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So, all right. So taken as a whole, people seem to be mostly in favor of these 3 steps that could accelerate the adoption of zero-emission watercraft in New York State. So now let's open it up to Q&A. I think there are already a couple of questions out there.
Yeah, so from what I've seen, I know Hannah Atlas had a question for Karen, I believe. So Hannah, let me just unmute your mic.
And just a matter of process, what we'll do is unmute your audio for folks in the audience. And if you would like your video to be shown, just let us know. But otherwise, we'll start with audio. Perhaps not everyone wants to be live via video. Just give Sean some direction.
Okay. Yeah, her mic. And Hannah, your mic should be available.
Okay, I'm a member of the Urban Sustainability Committee at New York City Sierra Club. And we are trying to work on New York waterway ferry to reduce the emission that they have. And from your conversation, since they are private, from your conversation, you didn't touch action of how we can influence them as a private company.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think that's a really like $1 million question right there. New York Waterways is one of several private operators operating in New York City. We have Hornblower, We have New York Waterways. Then we have like tour boat operators, like New York Cruise Lines. You might see Circle Line. These are all independent companies. And I think, you know, there's the question of sort of influencing behavior, incentivizing behavior, mandating or regulating behavior, as was discussed. These are challenges. I think there are industry leaders like Hornblower who, for example, have one of the Statue of Liberty cruise boat has a powered by a hydrogen fuel cell, and they have a similar boat out in San Francisco doing the Alcatraz cruises, and the Maid of the Mist, which I highlighted. There are industry leaders that are ahead of others, without a doubt. Right now, the way to influence, you know, just to give you an example, like New York City NYC Ferry has a number of landings that they're proposing for 2021 with a public comment period to weigh in on these landings. Similarly, across the state, usually there's some sort of, you know, a public comment process to weigh in when there are new ferry landings, new routes, things like of that nature. You know, for the public to weigh in and to make it known to local elected officials, to local lawmakers that the you know, pollution impacts are a problem. I think the more we see pilots, the more there's, I think, pressure in the industry to act. Without, I think, further programs that would potentially incentivize action or require some sort of implementation as being discussed here, we're looking at industry leaders to take that first step, whether it's New York Waterways or Hornblower or some of the others. I think in the city, thinking about routes and destinations that would lend themselves well to these kinds of pilots, like Governor's Island, for example, which operates its own independent ferry boat, and will likely have an RFP in the next 2 to 3 years on a brand new, you know, upwards of 400-person vessel. Being able to showcase that what's possible, I think, is a way to drive those kinds of actions. And I think, you know, that it's incumbent upon groups like ours, Waterfront Alliance, and working with the public to make it known that there is a desire for it and an appetite for more sustainable vessels on our waterways.
Just an extension to the question, New York Waterway services New Jersey too. So I wonder if there's some kind of work to be done to have New Jersey and New York working together on that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, that's something, certainly I'm happy to sidebar with the Sierra Club working group that you're involved in, and having a conversation about who the right agencies and actors to bring together on that would be.
Yeah,
You're right. It is a bi-state, multi-municipal effort, you know, given that the routes are across the Hudson.
Yeah, we will be in touch with you.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank
Very
you.
good. We have a question from Dean. Well, it might be a bit of a statement. Dean, is there a question you'd like to ask, or just expand on your statement?
Okay, Dean, your mic should be available.
All right, well, maybe we should move on to.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Dean, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
yes.
Okay. There is a tugboat on the Erie Canal. It's full electric. It's been operating for about 6 years. There's been, it's had zero maintenance. It took a diesel engine out of it, a Detroit diesel, and they've been using it for moving barges and dredges and things of that nature. It was done by a New York State company, Elco Electric. Elco is an acronym for electric yachts or electric motors, and the company is Elco Motor Yachts. We've done a number of boats, and tour boats especially can get by with 1 or 2 charges a day because they're running relatively slow speed. But it would be interesting to see the New York State support the tugboat that's on the Erie Canal was done with lead acid batteries, and it's really due for a change and needs funding for lithium batteries or a combination of such. It could be hydrogen or fuel cell, but the tugboat has had zero maintenance on the electric system. Nothing, no cost at all. The savings have been probably in the range of $10,000 to $20,000 a year at operating costs.
So Dean, if I could jump in, I think tugboats are a good application because they're a point-to-point application. The operator just needs installation of one charging system at the berth of the port of the operator, and they don't go very far offshore, usually no more than 10 miles. So the distances involved are not so great.
Another attribute is that the Erie Canal, a good portion of its electric is self-made. They have hydro electric plants along the canal. Right. So it's a win-win situation. And there's more boats that could be electrified on the canal. It was originally under the auspices of the New York State Thruway Authority. And now I believe the canal is under the New York Power Authority, I believe. I'm not sure about that. But there's a poster child sitting right in the Erie Canal that could be used for promotional purposes. And the pictures of the tugboat are available if you were to Google Elco Motor Yachts. There's some nice pictures of the tugboat, but it's been in service about 6 years.
All right, that's a good example to know about. Sean, we've got a question from Linda.
Okay, let me let Linda open her mic.
So I just thought that would be very interesting for Karen.
Okay, Linda, your mic's available.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Linda, I see your picture, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I got to read the screen. I'm sitting outside, I'm sorry. I basically just wanted to know what were the odds that these propositions will come up in the legislature, given that everything's kind of on hold now and it's coming up in June. And that question was for Steve, I think. Can you hear me?
Is Steve still with us? He may have dropped out.
I can't see my screen so well because I'm outdoors.
If I were Senator Kaminsky's office, I'd probably drop off too with that question.
Maybe I shouldn't have warned him.
Right. I think that there's great hesitancy to say whether the legislature will come back or not after passing the budget. I think that at least the common feeling is that if the legislature does come back, it is to address extraordinary holes in the budget or other issues relating directly or indirectly to the pandemic. But I think in terms of any legislative action, I think these ideas are still in their infancy in terms of policy, and that we can use this year.
Sorry about that. It's been quiet all day. Now there's a helicopter.
To get language written and to discuss these things, to have further roundtables. So I think there's a lot we can do this year, even if it doesn't, get a vote. So we're still very early in drafting legislation.
Okay, thanks for that question, Linda. We've got a question from Catherine. Sean, if you can.
Yeah. Okay, Catherine, your mic should be available.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My question was about what is the state of the legislation at this point, but Roger just more or less answered that question of Linda's. And I have a question for Hans about where are most of your EV vessels manufactured? And are there very many of these companies who are working on the construction of these several different styles of vessels that you described with the electric vehicle, EVs?
Okay, hi Catherine. The development of the BB Green vessel was actually just recently finalized with all the type approvals from class societies, etc. So what we're planning though to do is to produce the vessels in Sweden or in other places. I mean, if we take the US, for example, they could be produced there, definitely. If the technology is known to a certain yard to make the carbon fiber, and that can be taught also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're just up a little after 5 o'clock. So this was scheduled for 90 minutes. Do we have any other questions pending, Sean?
Not that I see in the Q&A.
Okay. Well, then maybe we should call it a wrap. And I'd like just to close with one comment. So if you look over my shoulder, you'll see a photograph. And that photograph is of glacial ice in Alaska. And in Alaska, the Sierra, the Rockies, the Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes, Greenland, Antarctica, glaciers are melting. So we need to consider all steps to try to arrest the rate of emissions increase and bring down a decrease of emissions if we want to somehow stop glaciers from melting. And certainly that includes focusing on the transportation sector and within that sector, watercraft. So I do hope that the legislature in New York considers steps along the lines of what we've proposed today, and that we can make some progress here in New York as is happening in Northern Europe. So with those thoughts, I thank you for your time, especially during this extraordinarily difficult calamity that we are all experiencing, and be well and be safe. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, bye.
Thank you, everyone.